On a cold, rainy evening in Chicago, the city was alive with its usual hustle and bustle. Cars splashed through puddles on the streets, and people hurried to get out of the rain. Among them was a woman who had just stepped out of her prenatal yoga class. She was pregnant, glowing with the joy of expecting a new life, but also weighed down by the exhaustion that came with it. As she walked toward her car, parked under a flickering street lamp, she couldn't have imagined how drastically her life was about to change. The woman, dressed in a warm coat, unlocked her SUV and settled into the driver's seat. She sighed, grateful for a moment of quiet after a long day. But before she could even start the engine, chaos erupted around her. A car speeding down the wet road suddenly lost control. Its tires screeched as it hydroplaned across the slick asphalt, heading straight for her parked vehicle. Time seemed to slow down as the woman froze, her eyes wide with terror. The sound of the engine roaring closer felt like thunder in her ears. Unbeknownst to her, a young boy standing nearby noticed the danger unfolding. He was just 16 years old, tall and lean, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He had been walking home from his part-time job at a small convenience store when he saw the reckless driver lose control. Without thinking twice, the boy sprang into action. His heart raced as he sprinted across the street, dodging traffic and ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. There was no time to hesitate. He knew someone was in grave danger. Reaching the SUV, the boy yanked open the door and shouted at the woman inside, "Get out, now." His voice cut through her panic like a knife. Startled, she looked up at him, confusion mixing with fear. But something in his tone told her to trust him. With trembling hands, she unbuckled her seatbelt and allowed him to pull her out of the car. Just seconds later, the speeding vehicle slammed into her SUV with a deafening crash. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the once pristine vehicle was reduced to a mangled wreck. The woman stumbled backward, clutching her stomach protectively. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the wreckage in disbelief. If not for the boy's quick thinking, she, and her unborn child, would have been caught in the collision. Tears streamed down her face as reality sank in. She turned to look at her rescuer, her voice shaking as she managed to choke out, You saved us." The boy stood there, soaked to the bone and breathing heavily from the adrenaline rush. He nodded silently, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of relief and worry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to pour around them, blending with the distant wail of approaching sirens. Finally, the boy broke the silence. "Are you okay? Is the baby all right?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. The woman placed a hand on her belly and nodded, though her body still trembled. "Yes, I think so," she whispered. Then, looking at him again, she added, "Thank you. You saved our lives." Her gratitude was overwhelming, but the boy simply shrugged, as if what he'd done wasn't extraordinary. In truth, it was far from ordinary. Most people would have hesitated, frozen by fear or uncertainty. But this boy hadn't thought twice. He acted purely on instinct, driven by a desire to help someone in need. As emergency vehicles arrived and the scene became a flurry of activity, the woman couldn't take her eyes off the teenager. Who was he? Why had he risked his own safety for a stranger? These questions swirled in her mind as paramedics checked her vitals and assured her that both she and her baby were fine. Meanwhile, the boy quietly slipped away, disappearing into the crowd without asking for recognition or reward. But the woman wouldn't forget him. That night, as she lay in bed replaying the events in her mind, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find him and thank him properly. Little did she know their paths crossing was only the beginning of a story that would alter not only their lives, but also the lives of those closest to them. What happened next was nothing short of remarkable, a chain reaction of gratitude, sacrifice, and unexpected consequences. This chance encounter between two strangers from vastly different worlds would spark conversations, challenge perceptions, and ultimately reveal the true meaning of humanity. And all because one young boy chose to step forward when others might have turned away. The next morning, the woman couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had saved her life. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind. The screeching tires, the crunch of metal, and most importantly, the determined face of the teenager who had pulled her to safety. Her heart ached with gratitude. She owed him more than words could express, but she didn't even know his name or where he lived. All she had was the memory of his voice, firm yet gentle, urging her to move when panic had rooted her to the spot. Her husband, a wealthy businessman known for his sharp suits and sharper decisions, arrived home late that night after hearing about the accident. When he saw her sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, tears still glistening in her eyes, his expression softened. For all his flaws, he loved his wife deeply, and seeing her shaken like this unsettled him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "And the baby?" She nodded, clutching her belly protectively. "We're fine," she said softly. "But we wouldn't be if it weren't for him." Her voice trailed off as she described what had happened: the speeding car, the chaos, and the stranger who had risked everything to save them. Her husband listened intently, his brow furrowing as he processed the details. By the time she finished, there was no mistaking the look of disbelief and admiration on his face. "We need to find him," the man said firmly. "This isn't something you can just walk away from. He deserves our thanks." For days they searched tirelessly. They contacted local news outlets, posted flyers around the neighborhood, and even reached out to nearby schools and businesses. The story spread quickly, a pregnant woman narrowly escaping death thanks to the quick actions of an unknown hero. It wasn't long before someone recognized the description and pointed them in the right direction. When they finally found the boy, he was working his shift at a small convenience store tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. He looked up in surprise as the couple entered, their expensive clothes and polished demeanor standing out starkly against the modest surroundings. At first he seemed hesitant, unsure why these strangers were here. But when the woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with emotion, he understood instantly. "You're the one who saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." The boy shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being the center of attention. "It's okay," he replied simply. "I just did what anyone would have done." But the woman shook her head vehemently. "No, not everyone would have done that. You risked your life for us, for me and my baby. We owe you so much." Her husband stepped forward then, his presence commanding yet respectful. "You saved my family," he said, his tone sincere. "There's no way we can ever repay that. But please let us try." The boy glanced between them, his dark eyes thoughtful. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then with a small shrug he responded, "I didn't do it for anything in return. I just saw someone who needed help." His humility struck a chord with both of them. Wealthy and privileged, they were accustomed to people wanting something in exchange: money, favors, connections. But this boy stood before them, refusing to ask for anything despite having every right to do so. It was humbling, to say the least. Still, the man wasn't about to let the matter drop. "Please," he insisted, "let us show our gratitude. Name anything. Anything at all, and it's yours." The offer hung in the air, heavy with possibility. The boy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. For a fleeting second, the woman wondered if he might take advantage of the situation. After all, who wouldn't want to benefit from such generosity? But instead he surprised them once again. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. And with that, he turned back to his work, leaving the couple standing there, stunned by his restraint. Over the next few days, the boy's refusal to accept immediate payment gnawed at them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they owed him something significant. So they invited him to their home, a sprawling estate overlooking the city skyline. The contrast between his world and theirs was stark, but the boy didn't seem fazed. He walked through the grand halls with quiet dignity, his focus remaining entirely on the woman and her unborn child. During their meeting, the woman poured her heart out, expressing her gratitude in ways she hoped conveyed just how much his actions meant to her. "You gave us a second chance," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. How can we possibly repay that? Again the boy shrugged, though his expression betrayed a hint of unease. Finally, after some deliberation, he spoke. If you really want to help, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not for me. It's for my sister. The room fell silent as he explained. His younger sister was gravely ill, battling a condition that required expensive medical treatment. Their family struggled to make ends meet, let alone afford the care she desperately needed. Every day he worked long hours at the convenience store, trying to scrape together enough money to cover her bills. But it was never enough. As he spoke, the couple exchanged glances, their hearts breaking for the weight this young boy carried on his shoulders. Here was someone who had already given so much, yet continued to put others before himself. Without hesitation, the man promised to take care of everything. Consider it done, he said firmly. Your sister will get the best care possible. Relief washed over the boy's face, followed quickly by guilt. Thank you, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. The woman smiled warmly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Say you'll let us help, that's all we ask. And so the deal was struck, not as a transaction but as an act of pure kindness. Within days, the boy's sister was admitted to one of the finest hospitals in the region, receiving top-notch treatment paid for entirely by the couple. For the first time in months, the boy allowed himself to breathe a little easier, knowing his sister was finally getting the care she needed. But as word of their generosity spread, whispers began to circulate. Friends and acquaintances marveled at the couple's largesse, though not everyone viewed it favorably. Some accused them of using the situation to boost their public image, while others questioned whether their intentions were truly altruistic. Meanwhile, the boy faced challenges of his own. People in his community eyed him with suspicion, wondering if he'd somehow manipulated the situation for personal gain. Others resented him for attracting attention from the wealthy elite. Despite the scrutiny, the boy remained steadfast, focusing solely on his sister's recovery. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered, tensions that would soon come to a head, threatening to unravel the fragile bond between the three of them. As the weeks passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for everyone involved. The boy's sister showed signs of improvement under the care of the best doctors and treatments money could buy. For the first time in months, the boy allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. He spent his days juggling work at the convenience store, checking in on his sister at the hospital, and trying to keep up with school. Despite the weight of his responsibilities, there was a lightness in his step now, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to look up. The wealthy couple, too, felt a shift in their lives. The woman couldn't stop thinking about the boy and his family. She'd grown up in privilege, shielded from the harsh realities faced by so many others. But meeting him had opened her eyes to a world she'd only ever seen from a distance. A world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where every decision came with sacrifices, and where kindness often came at great personal cost. She admired his strength and selflessness, qualities that seemed absent from her own life. Her husband, on the other hand, approached the situation differently. To him, helping the boy's family was a matter of duty, a way to repay a debt. While he didn't regret his decision, he viewed it as a transaction, albeit an unconventional one. He'd provided financial support, and in return, he expected gratitude and perhaps even admiration. But what he hadn't anticipated was how deeply this act would affect his wife, or how it would begin to expose cracks in their marriage. One evening, as they sat together in their sprawling living room, the woman brought up the topic again. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked softly, staring out the window at the city lights below. Her tone was thoughtful, almost wistful. Her husband looked up from his phone, surprised by the question. "Enough? We've paid for everything. His sister's treatment, medication, specialists. What more could they possibly need?" "It's not about what they need," she replied, turning to face him. "It's about understanding what they've been through. That boy, he didn't ask for anything for himself, not once. And yet, here we are acting like writing a check makes us heroes. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. The man frowned, setting his phone aside. Are you saying I don't care? Because that's not fair. I did what needed to be done. Isn't that what matters? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm not saying you don't care. I'm saying, maybe we don't understand what caring really means. That boy risked his life for us, for our family. Do you know what that feels like? To put yourself in harm's way without expecting anything in return? Her husband leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. And I'm supposed to feel guilty because I didn't jump in front of a car? Is that it? No, she said firmly, her voice rising slightly. But you could try to see things from his perspective. Imagine growing up the way he has, with no safety net, no guarantees. Then tell me if you'd still feel so confident about your checkbook generosity. The room fell silent, the tension between them palpable. It was rare for her to challenge him like this, and he wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to remind her of all the good he'd done. But another part, the quieter, more vulnerable part, knew she was right. Deep down, he understood that his actions had been motivated by obligation rather than genuine empathy. And now, faced with her unflinching honesty, he couldn't ignore that truth any longer. Meanwhile, the boy found himself wrestling with his own emotions. On the surface, everything seemed to be going well. His sister was recovering, and the burden of medical bills had been lifted off his shoulders. Yet the whispers around him grew louder. Some people accused him of exploiting the situation, while others envied his newfound connection to the wealthy couple. Even his co-workers at the convenience store treated him differently, their comments laced with sarcasm or thinly veiled jealousy. Must be nice to have rich friends, one of them remarked one day, smirking as he stocked shelves. Bet you'll never have to work another day in your life. The boy clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. They're not my friends, he replied evenly. They helped my sister, that's all. But the remark stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Was he wrong to accept their help? Had he somehow betrayed his principles by letting them pay for his sister's treatment? These questions haunted him, making it hard to focus on anything else. At night, when the streets were quiet and the city seemed to hold its breath, he lay awake wondering if he'd made the right choice. Despite these doubts, he continued visiting his sister at the hospital, sitting by her bedside and holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. Seeing her smile, even weakly, reminded him why he'd accepted the couple's offer in the first place. Her laughter was worth any amount of guilt or judgment. Still, the growing divide between the woman and her husband cast a shadow over everything. The more she thought about the boy's courage and sacrifice, the more she realized how much her own life lacked those qualities. Her husband's cold pragmatism, once something she'd overlooked, now grated on her nerves. She began spending more time volunteering at local shelters and community centers, inspired by the boy's resilience and determination. Each visit reminded her of the stark contrast between her privileged existence and the struggles faced by those less fortunate. Her husband noticed the change in her demeanor but chose to ignore it, at least at first. He convinced himself that her newfound interest in charity work was just a phase, something she'd eventually grow tired of. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that this wasn't a passing hobby. She was changing, evolving into someone who cared deeply about causes beyond herself. And that scared him. One night, after another heated argument, she finally voiced what had been building inside her for months. I don't think we're the same people anymore, she said quietly, tears streaming down her face. You see, the world in terms of deals and transactions. But I've learned that some things can't be bought. Not trust, not respect, not love. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he saw the chasm that had formed between them wide and unbridgeable. He tried to argue, to explain that he'd done everything he could to fix the situation. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. Their values had diverged, and no amount of money or power could bring them back together. As the months wore on, the strain between them reached a breaking point. The woman filed for separation, citing irreconcilable differences. Friends and acquaintances whispered behind closed doors, speculating about the reasons behind their split. Some blamed the stress of the accident. Others pointed fingers at the boy and his family. But the truth was far simpler and far more complicated. They had grown apart, undone by the very act of kindness that had brought them closer to someone else. For the boy, watching the fallout from afar was both heartbreaking and humbling. He hadn't intended to cause such upheaval, but he also couldn't deny the impact his actions had had on everyone involved. In saving the woman and her unborn child, he had inadvertently set off a chain reaction, one that would reshape their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. The separation between the wealthy couple wasn't just a private matter. It became public news, spreading like wildfire through their social circles. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had opinions about what had happened. Some sympathized with the woman, praising her for standing up to a man who seemed more interested in power than people. Others sided with the husband, accusing her of being ungrateful and reckless. Amidst all the noise, the boy found himself caught in the middle, though he hadn't asked for any of it. For him, life was already complicated enough. His sister's health continued to improve thanks to the treatment she was receiving, but the emotional toll of everything weighed heavily on him. He tried to focus on his responsibilities, working at the convenience store, studying for exams, and spending time with his sister, but it was hard not to notice how much attention he was getting. People stared at him when he walked down the street, some whispering behind his back, others approaching him directly. One afternoon, while stocking shelves at work, an older man approached him. The man wore an expensive suit and carried himself with an air of authority. "You're the kid who saved that rich lady, right?" he asked bluntly, his tone somewhere between curiosity and disdain. The boy hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I guess so," he said cautiously. The man nodded as if confirming something to himself. "People are saying you ruined her marriage. Is that true?" The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut. Ruined? He hadn't intended to cause harm to anyone. All he'd wanted was to help, to save a life when no one else could. Now strangers were blaming him for things he couldn't control. "I didn't ruin anything," he replied firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "I just did what anyone would have done." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Not everyone would have stepped in like you did, and look where it got you, dragged into drama you probably didn't sign up for." With that, the man walked away, leaving the boy standing there, stunned. It wasn't the first time someone had accused him of causing trouble, but this conversation lingered in his mind longer than most. Was he responsible for the rift between the couple? Had his decision to accept their help made things worse instead of better? Doubts swirled in his head, keeping him awake at night. He replayed every interaction with the couple, searching for signs that he might have overstepped or misjudged. But no matter how hard he thought about it, he couldn't see another way things could have gone. If he hadn't accepted their offer, his sister might not be alive today. And yet the guilt of being blamed for their marital issues gnawed at him. Meanwhile, the woman struggled to adjust to her new reality. Moving out of the mansion she'd shared with her husband felt strange. It was like leaving behind a part of herself. She rented a small apartment downtown, far simpler than the luxurious home she was used to, but it gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she was making decisions based solely on what she wanted, not what was expected of her. She threw herself into volunteering, spending hours each week at shelters and community centers. Working alongside people who faced daily struggles reminded her of the boy's courage and resilience. One day, while serving meals at a local soup kitchen, she spotted him sitting at a table with his sister. They looked happy, laughing together. Despite everything they'd been through, her heart warmed at the sight and she approached them cautiously. "Hey," she said softly, smiling. "Mind if I join you?" The boy looked up, surprised but welcoming. "Sure," he replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. They talked for a while, sharing stories and updates. His sister, now stronger and more energetic, thanked the woman for helping them. "We wouldn't be here without you," she said earnestly, her eyes shining with gratitude. The woman shook her head, tears welling up in her own eyes. "No, sweetheart. You wouldn't be here without your brother. He's the real hero." After they finished eating, the boy walked the woman outside. As they stood under the evening sky, he hesitated before speaking. "I heard about what happened with you and your husband," he said quietly. "I'm sorry if I caused any of that." She sighed, looking out at the city lights. "You didn't cause anything. Our problems were there long before we met you. You just made me see things differently, made me realize what really matters." He frowned, still unsure. "But isn't it hard, starting over like this?" "It is," she admitted, "but it's also freeing. Sometimes change is painful, but it's necessary. I needed to remember who I am, apart from all the wealth and status." Her words stayed with him long after they parted ways. Change was painful, yes, but maybe it was also an opportunity, a chance to grow, to become stronger. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the struggles he'd always known. Maybe, just maybe, he could build a life where he didn't have to constantly fight to survive. Back at home, the boy's thoughts turned to his sister. Watching her laugh and play, free from the constant worry of medical bills, filled him with hope. She deserved a chance to dream big, to chase opportunities he'd never had. He vowed to do whatever it took to make sure she had that chance, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort. As for the husband, his world felt emptier than ever. Without his wife by his side, the mansion seemed cavernous, its grandeur mocking him. He tried to distract himself with work, pouring all his energy into expanding his business empire. But no matter how many deals he closed or how much money he made, the void inside him only grew larger. Late one night, unable to sleep, he wandered into his study and poured himself a drink. Staring at the amber liquid swirling in his glass, he thought about the boy, the teenager who had risked everything to save his family. What had driven him to act so selflessly? What kind of person put others' needs above their own without expecting anything in return? For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he'd been wrong, not just about the boy, but about life itself. Money and power weren't everything. In fact, they meant nothing without connection, without humanity. Slowly, painfully, he began to question the values he'd lived by for so long. The next morning, he decided to visit one of the shelters where his estranged wife volunteered. At first, he felt out of place among the volunteers and guests, unsure of what to say or do. But as he served meals and listened to people's stories, something shifted within him. These were individuals with dreams, fears, and hopes, just like him. Yet their lives were vastly different, shaped by circumstances beyond their control. By the end of the day, he realized he'd spent years viewing the world through a narrow lens. Helping others wasn't about writing checks or solving problems from afar. It was about showing up, listening, and truly understanding. It was messy, unpredictable, and often uncomfortable, but it was also deeply rewarding. Over time, the husband began volunteering regularly, slowly rebuilding his relationship with his wife, not as a romantic partner but as someone committed to making amends. Their conversations were tentative at first, filled with awkward pauses and unresolved tension. But gradually they found common ground in their shared desire to help those in need. As for the boy, his story inspired countless others. Neighbors, classmates, and even strangers reached out to thank him for reminding them of the power of kindness and bravery. He didn't seek recognition, but it came anyway, in the form of scholarships, job offers, and invitations to speak at events. Though he accepted some opportunities, he remained grounded, always prioritizing his sister's well-being and education. In the end, the accident that brought them together changed all of their lives in profound ways. The woman rediscovered her purpose, finding joy in helping others. The husband confronted his flaws, learning to value compassion over wealth. And the boy, once burdened by guilt and doubt, emerged stronger and more hopeful than ever. Their journey proved that sometimes, The smallest acts of courage can spark the greatest transformations. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about redefining what it meant to truly live. Months had passed since the accident, and life for everyone involved had taken unexpected turns. The woman who had been saved was now living in her modest apartment, embracing a simpler yet more meaningful existence. Her days were filled with purpose, volunteering at shelters, mentoring young students, and advocating for underprivileged communities. She no longer cared about fancy cars or designer clothes. Instead, she found fulfillment in helping others rise above their circumstances. Her connection with the boy and his sister only deepened over time, turning into a bond that felt almost familial. The boy, too, was navigating a new chapter of his life. With his sister's health improving steadily, he began to dream bigger, dreams for both of them. He worked tirelessly at the convenience store, studied hard for his exams, and even started applying for scholarships. People around him noticed the change. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, as though he finally believed he deserved better. For years, he'd been told by society that kids like him didn't stand a chance. But now, thanks to his courage and determination and perhaps a little bit of luck, he was proving those assumptions wrong. Still, not everything was smooth sailing. The whispers and judgmental stares hadn't completely disappeared. Some people continued to accuse him of exploiting the wealthy couple, while others envied him for stepping into a world they could never access. At school, classmates teased him for thinking he was better than everyone else. Teachers, unaware of the full story, sometimes treated him differently, assuming he no longer needed support because of his association with the rich family. One afternoon, after enduring yet another snide comment from a classmate, the boy retreated to the park near his house. Sitting alone on a bench, he stared at the ground, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. Was this what gratitude looked like? A constant battle against doubt, judgment, and misunderstanding? He hadn't asked for any of this attention. All he'd wanted was to save a life, to do the right thing. Yet here he was, caught in a storm he couldn't escape. As he sat there lost in thought, an elderly man approached him. Dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying a tattered bag, the man looked like someone who had seen more than his fair share of hardships. "Mind if I sit here?" the man asked, gesturing to the empty space beside the boy. "Sure," the boy replied, scooting over slightly. The man settled onto the bench, exhaling deeply as if relieved to rest his tired legs. After a moment of silence, he glanced sideways at the boy. "You're the one who saved that pregnant lady, aren't you?" The boy stiffened, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I guess so," he muttered, bracing himself for another lecture or accusation. But the man simply nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That took guts. Most folks wouldn't have done it." "It wasn't about guts," the boy said quickly, shaking his head. "It was just instinct. I saw someone in trouble and I acted. Anyone would have done the same." The man chuckled, softly, shaking his head. "No, son, not everyone would have done the same. Trust me, I've seen enough of the world to know that most people look away when things get messy. You didn't look away. That makes you special." The boy frowned, uncomfortable with the praise. "I don't feel special. If anything, I feel like I'm stuck in the middle of something I don't understand. Everyone keeps talking about what I did, but nobody cares about what it cost me." The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What do you mean? What did it cost you?" The boy hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "People judge me for accepting help. They say I'm using the couple, or that I'm trying to climb out of my situation by riding on their coattails. And then there's the guilt. Their marriage fell apart, and some people think it's my fault. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to save a life." The man listened intently, his weathered face softening with empathy. When the boy finished speaking, he sighed heavily. "Life's funny like that," he said. "Sometimes doing the right thing comes with consequences we can't control. But here's the thing, son. You can't let other people's opinions define you. You did what you thought was best, and that's all anyone can ask of you." His words struck a chord deep within the boy. He realized that he'd been letting the negativity consume him, allowing other people's judgments to dictate how he felt about himself. Maybe it was time to stop worrying about what everyone else thought and focus on what truly mattered: his sister's future, his own dreams, and the lives he could touch along the way. Meanwhile, the husband was undergoing his own transformation. Volunteering at shelters and community centers had opened his eyes to a side of life he'd never truly understood. Growing up in privilege, he'd always viewed success as a numbers game: how much money you made, how many deals you closed, how big your empire grew. But now, surrounded by people who measured success differently, by kindness, resilience, and community, he began to see how shallow his old mindset had been. One evening, after serving dinner at a homeless shelter, he struck up a conversation with a young mother struggling to provide for her 2 children. She spoke candidly about her challenges, working multiple jobs, relying on food banks, and praying every night that her kids would grow up safe and healthy. As she talked, tears streaming down her face, the man felt a lump form in his throat. This was a woman fighting tooth and nail for her family, just like the boy had fought for his sister. And yet, she hadn't received the same opportunities or the same recognition. For the first time in years, the man felt ashamed of his wealth, not because having money was inherently wrong, but because he'd spent so long hoarding it instead of sharing it wisely. He'd always assumed that writing checks was enough, but now he understood that true generosity required more than financial contributions. It required presence, empathy, and a willingness to roll up your sleeves and get involved. That realization marked a turning point for him. He began donating not just money but also his time and expertise. He used his business skills to help local nonprofits expand their reach, mentored young entrepreneurs from underserved communities, and even started a foundation aimed at providing resources for families facing medical crises. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt his reputation, not as a ruthless tycoon, but as someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. Despite their individual growth, tensions between the woman and the husband still lingered. Though they occasionally crossed paths at volunteer events or charity functions, their interactions remained strained. The woman appreciated his efforts to change, but she couldn't forget the years of emotional distance and dismissiveness that had driven them apart. For his part, the husband struggled to reconcile his past behavior with the person he was becoming. One chilly autumn evening, they found themselves working together at a fundraising gala for children's health care. As they stood side by side, organizing tables and greeting guests, the atmosphere between them was awkward but civil. Finally, during a lull in the event, the woman turned to him and said, "Thank you for everything you've done lately. It hasn't gone unnoticed." The man blinked, surprised by her words. I don't deserve your thanks," he admitted, his voice low. "Not after everything I put you through." She smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "Maybe not, but you're trying, and that counts for something." Her acknowledgement meant more to him than she could have imagined. For months he'd carried the weight of his failures, convinced that he'd never earn forgiveness. Not from her, and certainly not from himself. But hearing her acknowledge his efforts gave him hope that redemption was possible. As the night wore on, they continued working together, their movements synchronized despite the lingering tension. By the end of the event, they shared a brief hug, a gesture that felt tentative yet genuine. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't afraid to face it. Back at home, the boy reflected on how far he'd come. Life was still far from perfect, but he was learning to navigate its complexities with grace and resilience. His sister's laughter echoed through their small apartment, a reminder of why he kept pushing forward. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He'd already proven that he was capable of extraordinary things. In saving a life, he hadn't just changed the trajectory of one family, he'd sparked a ripple effect that touched countless others. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone involved, including himself, that true strength lies not in wealth or power, but in the courage to act with compassion, even when the odds are stacked against you. The months rolled on, and the lives of everyone involved continued to evolve in ways none of them could have predicted. The woman who had once lived a life defined by privilege and routine now found herself thriving in her newfound purpose. Her days were no longer about attending fancy galas or keeping up appearances. Instead, she dedicated herself to creating real change. She poured her energy into building a foundation aimed at helping families facing medical emergencies. Families, like the boys. It wasn't just charity work for her. It was personal. Every story she heard reminded her of the night she'd been saved, and every family she helped felt like a step toward repaying the debt she owed. Her foundation quickly gained traction, attracting donations from people who admired her commitment to making a difference. But she didn't stop there. She also started mentoring young students from underserved communities, encouraging them to dream big and believe in themselves. One of those students happened to be the boy's sister, whose health had improved enough for her to return to school. Watching her thrive under the woman's guidance filled the boy with pride and relief. For so long, he'd carried the weight of his family's struggles alone. Now, for the first time, he felt like they weren't just surviving, they were truly living. As for the boy, life was still challenging, but he faced each day with a renewed sense of hope. His hard work paid off when he earned a scholarship to a local college, a feat that seemed impossible just a year ago. People around him marveled at his determination, but to him it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about giving his sister the future she deserved and showing her that no obstacle was insurmountable if you refused to give up. Still, not everything was easy. Despite his achievements, the whispers and judgmental stares persisted. Some people couldn't let go of their resentment, accusing him of using his connection to the wealthy couple to climb out of poverty. Others dismissed his accomplishments, claiming he only succeeded because someone else paved the way for him. At times, the negativity threatened to overwhelm him, but he reminded himself of the elderly man's words. You can't let other people's opinions define you. One evening, as he walked home from his shift at the convenience store, he passed by the park where he'd spoken to the old man months earlier. He stopped for a moment, sitting on the same bench where they'd shared that conversation. Looking out at the quiet streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, he reflected on how much had changed. Life hadn't become easier, not by a long shot, but he'd grown stronger. He'd learned to focus on what mattered most, his sister, his dreams, and the knowledge that he'd done the right thing, even when it cost him dearly. For the husband, the journey of self-discovery was ongoing. Volunteering and working with the less fortunate had transformed him in ways he never expected. Where once he saw problems to solve, he now saw people to connect with. He began spending more time listening than talking, understanding that true empathy required patience and presence. His transformation wasn't lost on those around him. Former colleagues who once dismissed him as cold and calculating now respected him for his humility and dedication. Even the woman, though still cautious, acknowledged that he was trying to be a better version of himself. But perhaps the most surprising development came when he decided to step away from his high-profile career. After decades of chasing wealth and status, he realized that none of it brought him lasting happiness. Instead, he chose to dedicate his time to causes he cared about, using his resources to uplift others rather than accumulate more for himself. He sold his mansion, moved into a modest apartment downtown, and began volunteering full-time at shelters and community centers. It was a drastic change, but one that felt deeply fulfilling. One afternoon, while serving meals at a soup kitchen, he spotted the boy sitting at a table with his sister. The two laughed together, their bond unmistakable. The man hesitated for a moment before approaching them. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat. The boy looked up, surprised but welcoming. "Sure," he said with a small smile. They talked for a while, sharing updates about their lives. The boy mentioned his upcoming classes at college, and the man listened intently, offering advice based on his own experiences. When the conversation turned to the past, the accident, the rift between the man and the woman, and the challenges they'd all faced, the boy spoke candidly. "I never meant to cause trouble," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. All I wanted was to help. The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. And that's exactly what you did. You didn't just save a life. You changed ours. Maybe we needed that wake-up call. His words caught the boy off guard. For so long, he'd assumed he was the one who owed the couple gratitude. But hearing the man acknowledge the impact of his actions made him realize that kindness often works both ways. By stepping up when it mattered most, he'd given others the chance to reflect, grow, and transform. As time went on, the woman and the man crossed paths less frequently, but their interactions grew warmer. They weren't friends, not yet, but there was mutual respect between them. Both had embarked on separate journeys of healing and growth, and neither harbored ill will toward the other anymore. In fact, they occasionally collaborated on projects through the Woman's Foundation, combining their skills and resources to create meaningful change. Their shared history remained complicated, but it no longer defined them. They were different, people now, kinder, wiser, and more aware of the world beyond their own bubble. And while their marriage may have ended, the lessons they learned from each other endured. Years later, the boy graduated from college with honors, his sister cheering proudly from the audience. The woman sat beside her, tears streaming down her face as she watched him accept his diploma. Nearby, the man stood quietly, clapping along with the crowd. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and they exchanged a knowing smile. None of this would have been possible without the courage of a young boy who refused to look away when others were in need. In saving a life, he hadn't just rewritten his own story, he'd inspired everyone around him to rethink what it means to live fully. The accident that brought them together had shattered their old lives, but in its aftermath, they built something far greater, a legacy of compassion, resilience, and hope. And as they stood there, united by gratitude and respect, they knew that their journey was far from over.